Good morning. I've been wanting to do this video for a while, and I want to be really clear. Like the other day, we talked about the fact that there are different levels and different types of documentation from the state that outlines what we are allowed to do, how we can be licensed, and our behaviors, consequences, programming, all of those things. And in that lecture, I said that statutes are the laws, and you can see Colorado Revised Statutes for 2021, Title 12, Profession or Healthcare Professions and Occupations, Article 245, which is in the Mental Health Practice Act. This is the law. This is what the Colorado legislature dictates and outlines that we are permitted to do. And I'm going to go through that and show you several areas of this document that are really important. What I'm showing you now, Colorado Mental Health System, Department of Human Services, this is the rule. And rules are explanations of what... So if you think about the law as just statements of fact, the rules are the state's way of what we would consider operationalizing the rules, or operationalizing the laws. So it's really written in a more policy and procedure kind of way. So today, for the purposes of this lecture, I really want to go through some of the requirements of the law. And in class, I said that I would send you a copy of this with highlights of areas that I think are particularly important. So one of the things that I want to make you aware of is that in each section, and there are, I think, 8 parts to this document, it always starts with definitions, like what is a board, and the highlighted factor here is certified addiction counselor means a person who is an addiction counselor certified pursuant to the law. And so it's really important to understand that based on our certifications, our license, our education, we have certain privilege to practice specific areas of care. And so we also have the privilege of calling ourselves by a certain title. So I cannot say that I'm a certified addiction counselor unless I'm certified. And it's the same way with professional counselors. It's the same way with social workers. And so by getting certified, getting licensed, getting the education that we have, that it allows us to practice. And so if we find someone who is, and the one that's really common will be marriage and family therapists. And so I have a PhD in marriage and family therapy. I cannot call myself, like an LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm not licensed as that. I can supervise because I have like special permission from the board based on my training and education, but I have to be careful in how I title myself or what I call myself. I can say that I do marriage and family therapy, but I cannot say that I am licensed as such any more than someone who is an LPC can do addiction counseling. Licensed professional counselor can work with clients with primary addiction issues, but they can't call themselves an addiction counselor by the same title as someone who is licensed or certified in that area. So be really careful, as you're going through this, to read the definitions. Here's definition for licensed addiction counselor, certainly an addiction counselor who is licensed professional counselor who is licensed social worker, MFT. The definition of a professional relationship. And if you remember our first assignment in this class, really looking at the relationship between the client and the therapist, and did it violate by moving beyond a professional relationship to more of a friend or intimate relationship. So things like psychotherapy, we may all have very broad definitions of those. Well, our definition of it isn't nearly as important as what the state, how the state defines it. So be really careful when you're kind of going through your process. After you've gotten your certification and you're working in an agency, or you're doing whatever it is that you're doing with your certification, but that you have a pretty good idea of how these areas of practice are defined. So psychotherapy means the treatment, diagnosis, testing, assessment, or counseling in a professional relationship to assist individuals or groups to alleviate behavioral or mental health disorders, etc. So, if anything were to happen ethically, they're going to use this definition and ask us to explain what we were doing based on the definition of psychotherapy. That is, if we are therapists, if we're techs or other certified individuals, that would be slightly different. But understand these various definitions, because I know you will see a couple of those. I know there's a definition on the quiz, and I think that there are some on the final exam as well. And so I just highlighted this just because it was something that I was talking about a minute ago. But the idea of practicing outside of or beyond one's professional training, experience, or competence. The handbook clearly outlines what you are allowed to do as a behavioral health tech or as an addiction tech. And it is less than what someone who is a CAS is allowed to do. And that's even less than what someone who is a LAC or a licensed addiction counselor is allowed to do. So people get sanctioned every year for practicing outside of their scope. People doing specific kinds of clinical work without having the appropriate training or education to do that. Other therapists who, for good or bad, who have the appropriate licensure and certification to practice a certain area. I know several who are constantly sort of checking the internet and for looking for people who are advertising, and we're going to talk about advertising in a little bit, and who are practicing outside of their scope, and then report them to the board so that they'll receive a cease and desist order from the board that says you're not qualified to do that level of care, so you have to stop. And so I guess I tell you this to be more aware that, right now you're moving into the CAT area, and you have to be really clear on what that allows and only do those things. So if we continue on, and you'll see that there's a lot of this that's really about the board and what the board is allowed to do. Fees, you can see here, renewal fees for once you have your certification. We have a biannual license and certification process in Colorado, so every 2 years you have to make sure you get your professional kind of your CEUs, your continuing education units, the training, and then pay your fee. So, and you're going to have to demonstrate that you have completed that by showing certifications, etc. The other thing I just wanted you to understand is that while you are going through this entire process of being certified by participating in the training and taking the exams, that people who have been trained in other states who meet the criteria, the requirements for certification or for licensure, can actually be licensed by what we call endorsement, which means when I moved from Florida to Colorado, I was a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, which actually exceeded the requirements for the licensed professional counselor, and so I was licensed by endorsement when I moved to the state of Colorado. And so the term that we use and that you'll hear people talk about is a portability program, and the desire that every one of us have to be able to port our license to other states. And so it's important to understand that we can only practice and we can only treat people in the state that we are a resident in and that we are licensed in. And so even though I know a lot of people in Florida, I'm not licensed there. Foundry is not licensed there. And so I cannot do psychotherapy with someone in another state. So you can only practice in the state that you're licensed in. Now, coaching is different. So people who want to be recovery coaches or family coaches, things like that, they are not part of a certification and licensure process that is sanctioned by the state of Colorado. So if that's your goal, you can do coaching across state lines, meaning you could coach someone via the internet in Florida as long as you're a certified coach. And there are lots of different certifying boards for coaching, but you cannot do treatment of addiction or mental health issues outside of the state that you are licensed in. And that's more complicated than it appears, so that someone could be a client in Colorado who goes to Florida for the winter, and you could continue to see them because their primary residence is in Colorado, and you are licensed here or certified here, so you can continue to do that. But it's not as straightforward as people may think that it is. So there are a couple things that I really want to show you that are going to be part of the test, and but they're just really critical. So you can see there's a lot of stuff that it's good to read. This is a 79-page document, but there are certain things that I think are just really important. So the first one. So when a client comes to the Foundry, we actually have them do paperwork twice. Once when they arrive, which really allows them to do an informed consent for treatment, and the other is really the same process, only they've been sober for a period of time. They can remember that they signed it, and they can remember what the information is on it. So I believe, as the Chief Clinical Officer, that it's an ethical thing to do. And it's amazing how many agencies around the country, and when I'm speaking around the country on ethics, I'll often ask, how many of you engage in that practice and have people sign the disclosure agreement or the informed consent form twice, once to allow you to detox them and then once to allow you to treat them. And it's amazing how many people or many agencies do not do that. And so mandatory disclosure is that you are giving the client the opportunity to understand what it is that you do, how you do it, what your degrees are, what your credentials are, what kind of therapy you're going to be using, where the business is located, like where's the corporate office. And so I'll just go through these because I think they're really important. So on this disclosure form, or the informed consent, clearly the name, business address, business phone number of, if it's a private practice, it would have their contact information for their office of the person who's licensed or registered psychotherapist or certified. So at Foundry, we have a form that has our disclosure statement has every single employee that the client is going to have an interaction with, has a bio about them, where they're from, their credentials and those kinds of things. And so even though they meet me rarely, I'm on that form because I do some lectures for them. The counselors, the techs, nursing, physicians, so that anyone who's coming in can have a sense of who they're going to be working with. Now, the second thing that has to be on there is an explanation of the levels of regulation that we, as the Foundry or wherever you work, so who monitors you? And so we have a discussion on our disclosure statement of what a CAT is, what a CAS is, what a licensed professional counselor is, kind of how those are defined by the state. We have information on DORA. So if you can remember, I showed the website for DORA where it allowed people to file a grievance if we had done something that the client believed was against the rules. And so it has to give that information. What is the DORA phone number? How do you file a grievance with DORA? An explanation of our own grievance policy. The third thing that has to be on there is a list of degrees, credentials, certifications, registrations, and licenses held by any staff member who is going to interact with that client. And so, basically a clear outline of the competencies of the individuals that the client will be interacting with. So, again, in a private practice, that's going to be a pretty simple deal. In an agency, and I think we probably exceed the requirement by including all of the bios of everyone who will interact with that client. Many places probably will have the primary therapist have their own disclosure statement. And so if we get an intern from a university, I will have them do their own disclosure statement on the one that we use that clearly states that they are a student, what university, what is the governing body in that university to deal with grievances or to deal with concerns, so that the client, when they sign this, which basically says, okay, I'm coming into treatment with you, has all of the information needed to go forward. Statements of what kind of therapy do we do? And we have a whole list of probably 30 different therapies that we use in our program. The duration of therapy. And so often clients don't really understand that while they think we dictate length of stay, a lot of times insurance companies will dictate length of stay. So to explain that to the client, or to at least give them some estimation of how it works. And typically we will have a client for anywhere from 1 to 3, maybe 4 days of detox. If they haven't detoxed in another facility, they'll spend approximately 3 weeks in what we would consider RTC, residential treatment, and probably another 10 to 14 days in partial hospital, which is a step-down program where they live in the community and receive treatment in our ranch. So, kind of explaining those things. And then the last one is fee. How do they pay for treatment? on this document, it has to clearly state that the client always has the right to seek a second opinion from another therapist, and that they can leave at any point that they want to leave. We are not like a psychiatric receiving facility. We don't deal with M1 holds, which is what if someone is deemed to be a danger to themselves or others, they have a hold that allows a hospital that is designated to receive those individuals, or receiving facilities, for 72 hours. Within that 72 hours, at any point at which they believe that the person is not a danger to themselves or others, or that that person no longer meets the requirement for the M1 hold, that they have to discharge that client. And so we are not that kind of facility. We don't ever put our hands on a client for any reason, or that idea of holding. We don't hold a person in treatment against their will. They can leave at any point. We call it an AMA, or against medical advice discharge, or an ACA, against clinical advice. So if they say, I want to leave, we usually try to get them to relax a little bit, think about the decision, and if they insist on leaving, we take them into town for them to find their way back to Denver or wherever they live. The statement here, and I'm going to highlight it, has to be on the disclosure statement. And it says, in a professional relationship, sexual intimacy is never appropriate and should be reported to the board that licenses, registers, and certifies the licensee, registrant, or certificate holder. And so that idea that, this is never in question. Anytime that a client believes that anything inappropriate in that area, or if I were to believe that someone, is having an inappropriate level of interaction at the facility, that we're all required to report that. And the last is information provided to the client during therapy is confidential, and we have to have a brief discussion of what confidentiality is. And so these are all, from here to here, are required. They have to be on that form. And so when the Office of Behavioral Health comes to the Foundry and says, we want to review charts, the first thing they're going to do is go through a checklist and monitor our forms to make sure our forms are in compliance. And so, as a tech, you're going to depend on, the clinical director to make sure that all of these things are in place. In our last OBH site visit, we had no findings, which means everything was fine. The next thing I want you to focus on is the disclosure of confidential information. And this requires that we have a policy and we have a procedure for signing consent forms, disclosure forms, and other kinds of releases, both of information. So, and we can talk about some of those, but a licensee, registrant, certificate holder cannot disclose without consent of the client any confidential communications made by the client or advice given to the client, etc. So you may remember the story that I told about the nurse who, as the police officer was walking back to the unit after a grievance was filed, or she called the police, that when that nurse started telling the police officer about the client, releasing confidential information about her case, that while she was really trying to be helpful, she unknowingly violated that client's confidentiality, and she was sanctioned by the state licensing board for nurses in the state of Colorado. Or not Colorado, this was back in Florida. So I highlighted the areas that we are allowed to release information when we do not have a consent to do so. And they'll make sense to you. And the first one is you're allowed to defend yourself. So if a person files a complaint or files a suit, and it's not just the client, but their heirs, the executors of their, if someone were to die in a treatment center, or the administrator of a client's estate, any of these folks that could file a suit or a complaint, that you are allowed to talk about that case in court. You are allowed to talk about that case in the event that the case is reviewed by your board, and again in a legal legal case, court case. So you can talk about the treatment, you can talk about the things that the client said, that once they file suit against you, you are allowed to defend yourself by telling the truth. The second, if you're working with a physician, a registered nurse, another person, you've been seeking consultation, or they've been seeking consultation with you, that if that other professional is someone files a suit against them, you now are entangled in that suit, because they're going to begin to look at who else has information about that case. And so you can discuss that case in a court of law with the licensing board, any of those individuals. Number 3, there are a variety of groups that do research, or let's say there has been a grievance filed against you with DORA, so that you can talk to any of the boards to explain what you did. Like, you don't need a release of information to defend yourself with the board. So, a board or a person or group, authorized by the board to make an investigation. Governing board of a hospital or licensed, or that is a licensed hospital. So let's say the hospital gets sued, and the hospital board is doing an investigation of what happened in that case. You are allowed to talk to the board to discuss treatment, to discuss actions taken, why they were taken, etc. And if the board, if someone does report you to the board, there will be a professional review of the case that is sanctioned by the board. So you are not only allowed to talk to them, but you're required to talk to them. The fourth area that you're allowed to release information on is if a client, regardless of age, makes an articulable, they've stated it, it's understandable, and significant threat against a school or the occupants of a school. So I'm going to go to school and I'm going to, shoot my teacher. I'm going to shoot all the kids that bullied me. Then we are, and if it was clearly said, clearly heard, clearly understood, then you are able to, you're actually mandated to report that to the school or to the person that was targeted. And if you remember, we talked about the Tarasoff case, and that was a big case that was about failure to report or failure to warn someone that a client had said they were intending to hurt. And then the other, regardless of client age, exhibits behaviors that in the reasonable judgment of you, the licensee or certificate holder, creates an articulable and significant threat to the health and safety of students, teachers, administrators, or other school personnel. Like you can. So if you remember when we were talking about federal confidentiality law, 42 CFR Part 2, and we basically said that we can only report if there's a medical emergency or if there was a crime committed in the premise. But it also said we can report these kinds of issues as well. So it's important to understand what you are allowed to report, when you are required to keep confidence, to keep things said quiet, and it's interesting. I was at a conference this weekend, Monday and Tuesday this past week, and we were walking through the conference hall, and there was a person who had been a client and of our facility, who after graduation has been doing really great things and really good work, and someone was talking, and this was actually with our CEO, Ben Court. I was talking with him, and there were people around, and I almost said, he was a client of ours, and which is okay because we work together. But if someone had been present who had been kind of eavesdropping on our discussion as we walked through this group of people, I could have very easily disclosed an inappropriate disclosure of information. So I caught myself and I did not say that. But it's really easy to do. So that's disclosure of confidential information. And again, this is the law. This isn't, ethics. Violating these violate our ethical practice, but these are the basic core minimums. You have to do these things. If you break these rules, you can no longer practice. Okay, this is the really important thing, and this is where we get into trouble. And so I'm going to go through each of these because they're critical. And so 12, 245, 224 are a list of prohibited activities, related provisions, and like definitions. But the idea of if you violate any of these rules or these guidelines, that you can be sanctioned, you can be grieved, and there are pretty significant consequences for these. So first and foremost, has been convicted of or pled guilty or nolo contendere to a felony or to any crime related to the person's practice, or received a deferred sentence to a felony. So if an applicant has had a felony conviction prior to the process of trying to be certified, that has to be reported, and then the board will most certainly ask you to explain what happened. What did you do after that? Maybe it was early in the middle of someone's addiction and they got a DUI, or they were arrested for possession of drugs or possession of a firearm, or any number of things that when we defend those things or we explain those things, we can still be certified, where we can still be licensed. So if in the course of holding a license or certificate, someone is arrested for a felony and is found to be guilty, or nolo contendere, which basically says, there's no way I can defend myself in this process, that has to be reported to the board. like someone gets a DUI. That has to be reported to the board. And it's so interesting when clients come in and they're professionals and they have the same or similar kinds of laws that we have. We will work with them to make sure that we're not going to report it to their board. Let's say it's a dentist or a veterinarian or somebody. We're not going to report it to their board, but they're going to have to report it, because every 2 years when we get licensed, it's going to ask, have you been convicted or pled guilty or nolo contendere to a felony, in the 2 years between your last renewal and now. And if you say no, and the answer is yes, that's lying to the board. And that's pretty certain that if they were to find that you lied to the board, that you would lose your license, maybe permanently. But, there would be a whole process for reconsideration. So, the idea of being arrested. The second, an individual has violated or attempted to violate, directly or indirectly, or assisted or abetted the violation of, I love this legal terminology, or conspired to violate any provision of the terms of Article 245. So this 79-page document is Article 245. And so if the board were to find that you were practicing outside the scope of 245, or you had created a business that was in violation of 245, that you would be reported to the board, and there would be sanctions, or there would at least be an assessment of what that was about. They would certainly have you change whatever it was that was happening that was in violation. I mean, it is possible to violate without knowing. So, 3, or C, has used advertising that is misleading, deceptive, or false. And so think about advertising a treatment center, if there was ever like the promise that, recovery in 90 days, the promise of lasting recovery, we're going to do away with relapse. Or someone who is not licensed who says they're licensed, or they falsely advertise their credentials, calling oneself a psychologist. If they have a bachelor's in psychology, the term psychologist is limited to only those individuals in the state of Colorado with a PhD in clinical psychology. So, or has a PsyD in clinical psychology. Number 4, has committed abuse of health insurance, meaning filed false claims saying we did these services and we need to be paid when those services were not actually carried out. As part of that, kind of C and D, has advertised through newspapers, magazines, circulars, direct mail, directories, radio, television, or otherwise, that the person will perform any act prohibited by Section 19 or 1813(1)(19). And that idea of you have to be really careful about what is allowed and what is not allowed, like things like conversion therapy or rebirthing therapy are no longer allowed, or at least rebirthing is not allowed in any form, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. That's a pretty interesting story. But so being really careful that you're not putting out something on Facebook or LinkedIn about a service that you're providing that in some way has been prohibited. Be very careful with social media, and be very careful allowing clients to connect to your social media. That often does not work out well. The next, E, habitually or excessively uses alcohol, or uses or abuses alcohol, other habit-forming drugs, or controlled substance. we are mandated to report peers who we believe are impaired. And we'll talk about that in one of our classes I think in the last class. And so if someone is impaired or someone is violating the general standards of our license or certification, that has to be reported to the board. Now the board would send that person to there's a health organization that does assessments and tries to help that person find appropriate treatment. But there may be periods of time where that individual is not permitted to practice until they have demonstrated that they have gotten their addiction under control. The F, it's not only addiction, but it's also physical illness. And so if someone has a physical injury, illness that prohibits them from working for a period of time, or from like a closed head injury, or the person has cancer, so they are going to have to not see clients for a period of time. So fails to notify the board that regulates the person's profession of a physical illness, physical condition, or behavioral mental health or substance use disorder that affects the person's ability to treat clients with reasonable skill and safety, or that may endanger the health or safety of persons under his or her care. You have to remember that these laws are intended to keep the citizens of Colorado safe. And so let's just say someone is a professional and they're getting older and they're having signs and symptoms of dementia, or let's say early onset dementia. These are things that it's really critical that the person report those findings to the board. The third part of F fails to comply with the limitations agreed to under a confidential agreement entered pursuant to the section, which basically says, if someone files a grievance against me and the board does an investigation and they say, you need to attend another ethics class, you need to get so many continuing education credits in this area of practice, and I agree and I sign that, and I go back to practicing and I don't do any of the things that they order me to do, or any of the issues that are part of the agreement, they can come back and sanction me again with probably far more severe consequences. G has, and you can see there's a fairly substantial list here, has acted or failed to act in a manner that does not meet the generally accepted standards of the professional discipline under the person's practice. And so at the end of this document, I will show you where all of the information is held that defines each of the professional disciplines, tells you what their responsibilities are, what their rights are, and so that is included in this document. But if you look at the DORA website and you look at the handbook for addiction counseling, it talks about competencies and that you have to be able to demonstrate the ability to act on those competencies, to act those competencies out. So it all comes into play. And so it isn't about just getting certified, it's practicing as a certified professional in the most appropriate way. So the second part of G, a certified copy of a malpractice judgment of a court or competent jurisdiction is conclusive evidence that the act or the omission does not meet the generally accepted standards. So if you are, every time you get you go into the renewal process, you will be asked, has there been a malpractice suit that has not only been, well, it'll first ask, has there been any grievance or suit filed against you? And then it will ask you if you were found guilty of malpractice. And if so, the board will say that you're not meeting the requirement for G, and you will have to go into either retraining or some other behavior. Okay. H, has performed services outside of your area of training, expertise, or competence. And that might be someone who is certified without a master's degree, who's doing EMDR, or has learned a technique and is practicing a technique where so a good example will be most tests that are given, like in testing, like we use the trauma symptom inventory. There are different categories that say you have to have this education in order to use this test, like the MMPI, which is a personality test. One has to have, be a licensed psychologist or trained in that test. So if someone decided to just use that, a coach decides to use that, and they're found to be doing that, they would probably be sanctioned because of practicing outside of one's scope of training or expertise. I, maintain relationships with clients that are likely to impair the person's professional judgment or increase the risk of client exploitation, such as treating employees, supervisees, close colleagues, or relatives. That's exactly what our first exercise was really about. That once that therapist began to realize that he had feelings for the client, that he had moved into a relationship that had the potential to impair their judgment in working with that client, and the potential for the increase of significant risk for that client. J, has exercised undue influence on the client. This is an interesting one, including the promotion of the sale of services, goods, property, or drugs in such a manner as to exploit the client for the financial gain of the practitioner. And in many cases, this could be a practitioner who wrote a book and then requires every client to buy that book. We can certainly recommend that a person buy our book, but we can't require that. And so this brings into question things like bartering, sales, services, goods. And so if we're just doing those things, let's say that the person has money to pay for clinical services, and they are a self-pay client, or they have insurance, and their insurance is paying for their care, and we sell some product. That's not bartering. Bartering is when a person does not have the ability to pay for services, and so there is a fair trade between the client and the therapist, or the client and the professional. We see a lot of like selling supplements and amino acids and things like that. So we have to be careful with those kinds of things, that we're not really just selling those to make extra money, but to demonstrate the efficacy of what we're doing, that it's effective and that it's useful. K, has failed to terminate a relationship with a client when it is reasonably clear that the client was not benefiting from the relationship and is not going to gain such benefit in the future. The idea of we are responsible, we do assessments, we do service plans, we are assessing the progress being made by clients. If we fail to recognize that this client is not getting any better, but we keep collecting the fee every week to treat them, that is a potentially as a potential violation of the law. that if we're not seeing progress, it is our duty to either seek consultation or to refer that person to someone else. And so the next L has failed to refer a client to an appropriate practitioner when the problem of the client is beyond the person's training, experience, or competence. And so if we just keep them because they're a good source of income, or we fail to refer them because we don't want to look bad, and that our our personal skill set isn't sufficient, that client does have the ability to come back and file a grievance against us. M has failed to obtain a consultation or perform a referral when the failure is not consistent with general accepted standards. That fits into K and L above. N is an important one for supervisors. Has failed to render adequate professional supervision of persons practicing pursuant to the Article 245. And so what that's saying is that supervisors have to actually provide supervision, and there needs to be an understanding of how that supervision is carried out. And so someone can't just sign off on hours because you've worked. O has accepted commissions or rebates or other forms of remuneration for referring clients to other professionals. And so it is against the law to say for a treatment center to tell interventionists, we'll pay you $1,000 for every referral that you make to us. That's a commission or a remuneration for referrals. We can have relationships with interventionists. We can have relationships with other therapists or other professionals, but we can't pay them for those referrals. That would be unethical. P has failed to comply with any of the requirements pertaining to mandatory disclosure. And again, all of those factors that are supposed to be on the mandatory disclosure form, and let's just say that a client wants a second opinion and we don't give that, we can be sanctioned for that. Q has offered or given commissions, rebates, or other forms of remuneration for the referral of clients, unless the offer was for services provided. And what they're really saying is, we can pay people for providing services for us. And in the process, that service may have resulted in a referral. And as long as we're paying them for the service and not for the referral, that we're good. Like marketing, office space, consultation, are all things that we can pay for services rather than referral. And then R has engaged in sexual contact, sexual intrusion, or sexual penetration as defined in Section 18.3.401 with a client during the period of time in which the therapeutic relationship exists or for up to 2 years after the period in which a therapeutic relationship exists. So this is interesting when you think about the NADAC Code of Ethics says that your client is your client in perpetuity. And in the Mental Health Practice Act, it says that you can have a sexual relationship with a client actually 2 years after the period in which the therapeutic relationship has ended. I think that's a bad, that would not be a very healthy practice. Although I know people, as I said, I know people who have done it. And so it's important to understand the first part of that sentence. The idea of sexual contact, sexual intrusion, or sexual perpetration or penetration, that different crimes are, different levels of crime are defined by those words. And so there are certain kind of intimacy violations that might be a misdemeanor, while sexual penetration would be a felony. And so these are things that you will, if those were to happen, that there has the potential for significant jail time and a fairly significant fine. S has resorted to fraud, misrepresentation, or deception in applying for and securing a license. If you lie on your application, that's what they're talking about. If you were to somehow pay off a state official, that would be the case. T has engaged in any of the following activities: repeated ordering or performing unnecessary lab tests. Boy, there's a lot of treatment centers and a lot of trouble for that. This idea of doing very expensive lab tests, and then they get money from the lab for each test, or doing certain kinds of other studies. Doing clinical activities that are on top of or above the cost of the program, that were really unnecessary, doing MRIs and things like that, or special services that, if you look at the service plan and you look at the services that were provided, if there are services that are maybe an extra fee that really have nothing to do with the service plan, that would be an unnecessary administration of a treatment. Ordering or performing any service or treatment that is contrary to the generally accepted standards of practice. And so they give the example of rebirthing. And rebirthing, there was a treatment center in Colorado, not an addiction treatment center, but a trauma treatment center that was really focused on attachment, had a method of therapy that they called rebirthing, and it was sort of and kind of dealing with birth trauma, where they would reenact the birth process, and people would be really kind of suffocated and lots of pressure on them by others, so that they could it would stimulate those memories of that process so that they could be worked on. And a client died in that process. And the state of Colorado, and I think virtually everyone at this point, has outlawed the use of rebirthing. So that idea of if someone does this really interesting, creative clinical program or clinical intervention that is deemed to be dangerous. Conversion therapy is another. And it's interesting, most states have outlawed conversion therapy altogether. And this is last year's law. And in the state of Colorado, it says conversion therapy with a client who is under 18 years of age. So, again, I would think that we would not be doing conversion therapy of any kind at any age, but it is certainly legal for adults. Anyone who's falsified or made incorrect entries into the chart. And so things that didn't happen, that someone goes back in, say a grievance was filed and someone goes in and fraudulently writes notes to say that, to cover their actions and things. Selling a license, so there's just other things. Fraudulent insurance acts and those things. So, as you can see, that's a lot of things that we're not allowed to do. And so I will guarantee you that you will see those again, in some aspect of those. So when I post the video, I am going to send this document to you. And it's going to take me an hour or so to process the video and get it ready for distribution. So I just want to go to a couple other things. So I had talked to you about if you have an impairment whether it's addiction or whether it's mental health issues or depression, and it gets reported to the board, that the board would make a referral to the mental health professional peer health assistance program. And in the state of Colorado, the agency that does that is called Peer Assistance. And Peer Assistance originally worked with nurses who had these issues, and now work with all of us licensed individuals. And so part of your recertification or your relicensing, there's a fee that every one of us who gets a renewal of our license pays, and it's a $25 fee per license that goes to funding peer assistance. And so the issues would be, or not the issues, but what peer assistance has the authority to do is provide education for mental health professionals with respect to the recognition and prevention of physical, emotional, psychological conditions, provide for interventions when necessary. I mean, I've done presentations for peer assistance on trauma and addiction. I've done presentations on the role of the family, things like that. So they will I did one on compassion fatigue for them. And so they will have education, and they'll invite all of the professionals who they're working with to participate in that training. Offer assistance to mental health professionals in identifying their conditions and recommending treatment. Evaluate the extent that these conditions impact or impair the professional's ability to work. If the cost of treatment, let's say the person doesn't have a lot of money and for whatever reason doesn't have insurance, and the board or the peer assistance recommends that they go to therapy, that if they can't afford it, there are hardship funds to pay for that. Peer assistance also monitors their clients who have been referred to treatment. So they become like an employee assistance program for the professional. So they receive referrals from the board, and they make services available. So this is, I probably don't need to go into this kind of detail, but these are things that I really want you to understand. These are things that will be on the jurisprudence exam. And you need to know, like, where to find them, because it can be kind of complicated. Excuse me. And so I had said that at the end of this document, there are sections where each discipline that has a license or a certification is outlined, and I just wanted to share you that. And sorry, I got something in my throat. Starting on page 38 of this document, it begins a process of describing each of the disciplines. So part 3 is psychologists. Social workers starts on page 45. Marriage and family therapists, page 55. Professional counselors, 65. And addiction counselors, 70. Why are addiction counselors last on the list? Because we're the newest license. And so that was just added. So if we go to page 70, you can see I've highlighted addiction counselors. So this gives us a definition, or the definitions of what addiction means. Persistent compulsive dependence on a behavior or substance, including mood-altering behaviors. What is administrative supervision? What's an approved school in terms of accreditation, or in terms of our graduates and our competency of our staff. And so let me just say the other thing. All of the things that I've highlighted so far are things that I think are going to be the more complicated questions in the jurisprudence exam. And that you're going to really want to be able to be really clear that if, remember I said the other day that there are often like 7 answers, and it might be A, B, C, A and B, A, B, and C, B and C, A and C. And so you're going to want to be able to know where to find those things and really make sure that that you know the exact question, or the exact answer to that question. There's a section on the state board that licenses us or certifies us. Here's the practice of an addiction counselor and our scope of practice. So as long as you're practicing within that scope, and there are kind of 3-4 things that are significant: our understanding of addiction, understanding of treatment, and knowledge of the philosophies and practices of treatment at different levels of care, application to practice, diagnosing, assessing, those things, and then professional readiness, the culture classes, understanding how to use critical thinking skills. So these would be the primary activities that we are allowed to do as addiction counselors: clinical evaluation, clinical intake, treatment planning, service coordination, counseling, groups, families, etc., recovery management, case management, supervision, etc. So these are the requirements for licensure. So you can kind of work your way through those. So I probably rambled on long enough. It's probably been about an hour. So, or maybe a little more. So I wanted you to get those. I want you to understand those, to know where to find that information. And so where the Mental Health Practice Act really outlines what we as professionals are able to do and required to do, the other document that I had showed earlier, 2 CCR 502, is really about agencies and levels of care. I have highlighted some things in this one, but I'm not going to go into that. But I'll include both of these in the classroom. I'll do an announcement where both of these are listed. So I'm going to start processing the video, and I will post it hopefully in the next hour or so. So thanks for paying attention, and I'll see you all on Thursday.